As we saw in the CRO for e-commerce growth course at CXL, once you start tracking and reporting on revenue metrics, the likelihood of making the wrong decisions due to the misinterpretation of the data increases dramatically. Revenue is a non-binomial metric, and there are several nuances you should be aware of when testing with this metric as an evaluation criterion. Welcome to a new CXL Feed. In this lesson, you'll learn how your testing tool tracks revenue, some of the most common KPIs to evaluate the impact on the bottom line, and you'll learn to run relative monetary impact and ROI estimations from your experimentation initiatives. The first step to understand you're making the right interpretation out of your revenue experiments is to understand how your testing tool tracks revenue. This might seem straightforward. However, there could be differences in the way different testing tools track revenue goals. For example, some testing tools might report on total revenue including shipping fees or taxes, while others will exclude taxes out of the mix. Some tools will work seamlessly between multiple currencies, while others will require you to do some further steps to ensure that the different foreign currencies are converted into your local one, for example. The way your testing tool tracks revenue goals shouldn't affect the data reliability. However, you should be aware of the nuances and the uniqueness of the tool you're working with. Before running experiments where you want to optimize for increased revenue, I strongly suggest you to read the documentation and understand how these metrics are being tracked so that you can be confident that you're making the right decisions. One other key element that you should keep in mind is that when evaluating revenue goals, you will now be working with non-binomial metrics, which can pose challenges related to variability and statistical accuracy. I by no means want to discourage you from optimizing for revenue goals. Just keep in mind that this is more advanced, and obviously you should take the necessary precautions to ensure that the data you are reporting on is really trustworthy. What you should keep in mind though is that unlike with a binomial metric such as transactions, in a non-binomial metric you will be measuring magnitude and direction. It's not only about whether a metric improves, but by how much. What this means from a more practical standpoint is that you should take the revenue analysis seriously, take enough time, potentially involve additional people just to make sure you're making the right decisions. When running experiments in an e-commerce context, two of the most common KPIs people aim to optimize for are conversion rates, which is the number of people who place an order in your store, and AOV or average order value, which is how much they spend in average. However, one potential issue with these metrics is that they don't show you the full picture on their own. That's why revenue per user tends to be a better evaluation criterion for experiments. Let me show you why with an example. Imagine that you have a baseline of 10,000 users, a 2% conversion rate, and an $80 AOV. This will result in a revenue per user of $1.60. Now, imagine that you managed to increase your conversions by 10%, but at the same time, your AOV decreased by the same 10%. Now, you're actually making less money. Your revenue per user will now be $1.80. So essentially, whatever we introduce to get this result wouldn't be necessarily a good choice or a decision for a company. Now see an opposite example. Let's imagine we decrease our AOV by 10%, but still manage to increase the AOV by 15%. Now our revenue per user will be $1.65, which means a plus 3% increase in total revenue. This is obviously an overly simplified example, but it's just so you have an idea of how easy it is to move into the wrong direction if you don't have all the elements into consideration. If you're starting out with your testing initiatives, revenue per user or revenue per visitor might be the best evaluation criterion you can work with before you start moving into more complex setups. Once you get familiar with tracking, optimizing, and reporting on revenue goals, sooner rather than later you will be asked what's the ROI of your experiments. This can get quite philosophical because you cannot simply take whatever you observe on a given experiment in terms of revenue impact and extrapolate it over the long term. It's much more complicated than that. However, there are models that you could still leverage to do ROI estimations from your experiments. As the famous British statistician George Box once said, all models are wrong, but some are useful. Here we're after usefulness by equipping you with ideas to still run some of these reports. Let me introduce you to the concept of relative potential revenue. There's a big mistake that a lot of companies that are new to A/B testing make. One potential issue with these metrics is they don't show you the full picture on their own. Let me show you why with an example. In this lesson, you'll learn how to measure the impact that your experiments have by tracking data across multiple platforms. It's very common for CRO teams to focus only on the surface level layer of an e-commerce business, without stopping to ask what are the actual financial implications of those improvements. Influencing business decision making is not an easy task. I hope this sparkled some ideas on your end so that you have a better reporting system for your CRO initiatives. The CRO for e-commerce growth was one of the top 5 most taken courses at CXL last year. We heard your feedback and now we're updating it with extra 15 minutes of content with over-the-shoulder examples of how to put some of the learnings into action. Go check out the update now at cxl.com.